So this is an audio and visual presentation for you guys. You do not have to view the live stream if you don't want to, but it is there so that anyone who has any concerns or questions that would be better answered by being able to see it visually. I wanted to make sure that I accommodated that. So we'll go ahead and get started here. So today we are visiting the 4 quadrants. These are the cornerstones of operant conditioning. And what we're going to go over today, we're going to have a little bit of technical terminology. We're going to differentiate between classical and operant conditioning, and touch a little bit on Pavlov's experiment to kind of help solidify what classical conditioning is. We're also going to define our 4 quadrants and our reinforcement, punishment, what the benefits and the risks are to each of these, as well as we're going to identify the quadrants that are at play with training tools. I know training tools is kind of a hot topic in the server, so I wanted to make sure that we touched on this today, especially because sometimes it can get a little bit confusing as to what quadrant is at play when we are using different tools. So we are also going to look at the physiological and psychological impacts that the use of the quadrants has, which is a huge reason as to why we do or don't use certain quadrants as much as reasonably possible. We're also going to look at defining different training methods using the quadrants, so compulsion versus balance versus positive, and then the subsect of positive reinforcement that is force-free. And at the end are the sources that were used for this presentation. We always like to make sure that we provide our sources so that if you guys are wanting to go deep diving down the rabbit hole, you guys have the links to what we used in order to create these presentations for you, and you have good sources for this information. So we're going to look at our technical terminology here today. So we're going to be doing, I don't know why this is in the middle of my screen for recording. We're going to be looking at positive. So in this instance, in this particular field, the word positive is used as a mathematical term. So this is to add to. So in training, this is the addition of a stimulus or something that is basically added to reinforce or to punish or what have you. Negative is used in the same connotation. It's used as a mathematical term. So this is to remove or subtract from. In training, this is the removal of a stimulus. Aversive, this is a term that we use quite a bit. So this is a stimulus or an event that the learner or the subject finds unpleasant. It's something that they don't like, they don't want to be around. This is typically used as far as negative punishment and negative reinforcement and positive punishment, and we'll get to that a little bit later. Appetitive, this is a stimulus or event that the learner finds pleasant. And then we also have the terms primary and secondary reinforcer. So these can get a little confusing. For some people, a primary reinforcer is a stimulus that does not need conditioning for the subject to find it reinforcing or rewarding. And then a secondary reinforcer is just a stimulus that requires conditioning for the subject to find it reinforcing. So these are going to pop up later in our presentation, those bottom two. They're going to pop up more towards the end. Any questions so far? Okay. So classical versus operant conditioning. A classical conditioning is defined as a learning process where 2 unconditioned stimuli are repeatedly paired, resulting in the subject responding to the first stimulus alone. So in this process, we have 2 stimuli that they're not conditioned, and the subject's response is also not conditioned. It is not a learned response. The first stimuli initially doesn't elicit any response, so it's a neutral stimulus. It doesn't mean anything, but it's followed by a stimulus that elicits an unconditioned response. So it's a response that the subject cannot help. Through repetition, that first stimulus, the neutral stimulus, starts to elicit a response from the subject prior to the presentation of the second stimulus. And a fun fact is that at that point, this is known as acquisition in classical conditioning. So this goes back to Pavlov's experiment. So I know that last slide is like a lot. But when we put it in the context of Pavlov's experiment, it makes a lot more sense. So initially, the experiment was meant to measure the salivary response in dogs when they were presented with food, but it resulted in this really cool but unexpected discovery. So what happened was they had the bell, which was the neutral stimulus. The bell didn't mean anything to the dogs prior to this experiment. Then they had the unconditioned stimulus, the food. This is the stimulus that elicits the unconditioned response or salivation from the dogs. So what they did was they rang the bell, then presented the food, and the food caused salivation. And through repetition, what happened was the dogs began to associate the bell with the presentation of the food. So the salivation response actually started before the food was presented. And through that, the bell became a conditioned stimulus, and the salivation became a conditioned response. So the salivation started to happen when the bell rang, rather than when the food was presented. So classical conditioning is a really integral part even of operant conditioning and just life in general. And some examples of this would be like repeated exposure of aversive events can result in fear, anxiety, and stress. So, when we have the dog that they go to the vet and they get their nails trimmed, and the first couple times they were uncomfortable, maybe the next time they're more uncomfortable, but they're kind of pushed through it. And it just kind of continues to become this association of when my feet are touched, things I hate happen, and now it's really scary. When we're doing operant conditioning and we're using a clicker, the way that we teach loading the clicker is classical conditioning. We're creating what is a neutral stimulus and pairing it with an unconditioned stimulus to create a conditioned response. And then like car rides are another great example. Some dogs, they love to go for car rides because it means really good things to them. Or they may not like car rides because it means really terrible things. So these are just some examples of our classical conditioning. Now, by comparison, operant conditioning is a learning process through which the strength of a behavior is modified through reinforcement or punishment. Okay, so classical conditioning, we're creating associations between different stimuli to create conditioned stimulus and conditioned responses, whereas with operant conditioning, we're strengthening behaviors through reinforcement or punishment. Questions at this point? Okay, I don't see anybody typing, so we're going to go ahead and keep moving. Okay, so these are our 4 quadrants. We have positive reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. So remember, we're thinking about positive and negative in those mathematical contexts. So positive reinforcement is going to be the addition of an appetitive stimulus in response to a desired behavior to increase the likelihood that the behavior is going to be repeated. Okay, so this is a prime example is, we teach our dogs to sit. The dog's butt touches the floor, they get a treat. That treat is the positive reinforcer. It's something that the dog finds pleasant to increase the behavior. And again, this is assuming that the dog is food motivated. Now, negative reinforcement is the removal of an aversive stimulus in response to a desired behavior to increase the likelihood that the behavior will be repeated. And so this is commonly used inappropriately. It also, some of this is out of our control as well. One of my favorite examples is potty training. So when we're doing potty training, we're actually using a combination of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement The negative reinforcement is the relief of the empty bladder or bowel. So we're removing the aversive stimulus, which is a full bladder or a full bowel. And then when we're actively potty training, we're giving a positive reinforcer when the dog goes where we want them to. So you can kind of see how there's some nuances to that. We're going to talk more about negative reinforcement here in just a minute and how it often is not appropriate to actively use. So positive punishment, so this is the addition of an aversive stimulus in response to an undesired behavior. Because when we punish, it's in response to an undesired behavior to decrease the likelihood that the behavior is going to be repeated. And so this would be like if you were to yell at your dog or tap them on the butt or those types of things. So it's something that they find unpleasant to stop and decrease the likelihood the behavior is going to happen again. Now, negative punishment is the removal of an appetitive stimulus in response to an undesired behavior to decrease the likelihood that the behavior is going to be repeated. And the most common negative punishment that we talk about, at least in my experience, is turning around and walking away from a dog that's jumping. They're seeking attention. We're taking that attention away from them. So is all of that kind of clear as mud? I'm assuming it all makes sense. Okay, we have a question here. As soon as my computer will load the question. I apologize. I'm on my laptop and my desktop so that I can field questions while I'm doing this presentation since it's full screen. Okay, laptop is being ridiculous, so let's just do this. Okay. Stopping walking because the dog is pulling, be negative punishment. If the forward motion of the walk is the appetitive stimulus, then yes, it would be because you're stopping that forward motion. So now typically that's not often a very effective punishment in walking. And we can talk about that a little bit more here in just a minute. But there's usually when a dog is pulling, it's because they have 4 legs. They walk faster than we do. And so they're also often overstimulated or very stimulated, if not overstimulated, so that the punishment of the stopping walking isn't as effective as we would like it to be. Now, for some dogs, it's very effective, but typically I find that it's not very. But that is a good example of negative punishment, assuming that the dog finds the forward motion appetitive, which a lot of dogs do. Okay. So, now our benefits of positive punishment and negative reinforcement versus our cons. So the benefits are quote-unquote quick results. So positive punishment and negative reinforcement suppress unwanted behaviors. They don't modify behavior, they suppress it. And the reason is because we're working in quadrants that are utilizing aversive stimuli almost completely exclusively in those quadrants when we're doing behavior suppression. This is also known as avoidance conditioning, so the subject learns to avoid the aversive stimuli through compliance. Basically they're being taught what not to do rather than what to do instead. That's more appropriate. It is beneficial in that it really doesn't take very much knowledge or skill outside of timing and intensity in order for this to be effective. So it's easy to apply. And for those who adhere to outdated behavior theory applications such as pack and dominance theory, like a lot of professionals do still, unfortunately, these quadrants fall well within those outdated methods. Now, we have a lot of cons by comparison. So the use of positive punishment and negative reinforcement, and this is intentional application because sometimes accidents happen, and we don't mean to, and our subject is the one that inherently dictates what is appetitive and what is aversive. Intentional application of these things can result in new behavioral problems that include, but they're not limited to, learned helplessness, anxiety, aggression. So not only are we trying to suppress unwanted behaviors, but we're risking creating new behavioral problems. We're also risking worsening current behavioral problems through the escalation of the dog's response to stimuli due to that fear, anxiety, and or stress. The reason for that is because positive punishment and negative reinforcement create physiological stress response, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. So it's escalating the dog's fear, anxiety, or stress. And as we all know, every dog is an individual. So some dogs are going to kind of fold in on themselves and resort to that kind of learned helplessness and give up, while other dogs are going to escalate their response, which is why we have the risk of learned helplessness, anxiety, and aggression. It also breaks down our trust and damages the bond with the handler and or the family who's working with the dog, because it creates this sense of unpredictability. It would be similar to if, the person that you live with, only bad things really ever happened around them. So you're not really going to trust that person. You're not going to have a good bond with them. It's going to be a fairly traumatic existence. And our long-term physical repercussions from injury or chronic use of physical positive punishment, this includes corrective collars, no pull gear, chronic stress exposure. So there's a lot that can be happening on the physical side as well as the emotional side with these things. And no pull gear is on there because they do work within the positive punishment and negative reinforcement quadrants if they're being used as the tool to train, as the primary method to train with. It also requires more guesswork on the subject, and this can really lead to an increase in undesired behavior because the dog is having to figure it out. Okay, what did I do that happened? What do I need to not do in the future? We're not really providing them with good information with these quadrants. And there's really no evidence of superiority of use of these quadrants over positive reinforcement and force-free methods. So there's not really a reason to actively be using these quadrants, if that makes sense. Does anybody have any questions about this slide? Okay, I don't see anybody typing, so I'm going to move on. Now, our risks versus benefits of positive reinforcement and negative punishment. So our positive reinforcement builds confidence and it enhances bonding between the learner and the teacher. Our negative punishment is really just a backup quadrant when it comes to the use of positive reinforcement, as much as it reasonably can be. Again, accidents happen, and the subject is the one who determines what is and is not reinforcing. But we're focusing really more on preventing unwanted behaviors and reinforcing the wanted behaviors. So these guys that have been trained with positive reinforcement in studies have shown more creativity in their problem solving, more rapid learning, and a greater eagerness to work compared to dogs that have been trained using positive punishment and negative reinforcement. It also provides flexibility in your approach and your breakdown and modifying behaviors, because when we're working in these quadrants actively, we should be looking at Okay, the dog was not successful, or this happened that I didn't want to happen. What do I need to change to set the subject up for success? And these are easy to apply as long as you have good critical thinking skills, as far as breaking down the behaviors. And it's so easy to be able to reinforce desired behaviors as well. Um, you also have a lot more versatility in the availability of reinforcers. So if you're using negative reinforcement, you're removing something that's aversive. But if you're working in positive reinforcement, you have almost unlimited things to try to see what's reinforcing for your dog. You have food, access to environment, toys, sniffing, anything that's within a natural behavior for your dog is going to fall within positive reinforcement and a potential reinforcer. So this is why we do things like, oh, your dog digs, let's, provide an appropriate outlet for that. It reinforces the digging behavior in an appropriate area. It doesn't require any physical force, coercion, or other stress-inducing methods, which is really important because we're really focused on making sure that these guys have long, happy, well-adjusted lives as much as possible. And our current research and recommendations from behavioral experts and qualified veterinary behaviorists support the use of these quadrants. Now, our risks and our cons, we do have some. It does require greater critical thinking skills on the teacher's part when faced with difficulty. It does require greater skill and understanding of behavior, body language, all of those really important components that we need to take account of for these learning subjects, for these dogs, and really any animal that we're working with, because learning is universal. And then you do have a risk of accidental behavior loops if your timing or your reinforcement isn't appropriate. And what I mean by that is, if you have a dog that is like bounces before they sit, you may accidentally put that bounce into the loop of the behavior. I have a couple of questions here coming up. Oh my gosh, what happened here? Is it possible to be using positive reinforcement and negative punishment concurrently? Do a lot of exercises like choose to heel, where I walk around ignoring the dog until she decides to heel and then reward. So, yes, you can use positive reinforcement and negative punishment concurrently. I would say a good example of this would be a dog that's engaging with a stimulus that you don't necessarily want them engaging with, and they're redirected. So in that very split second, it's not going to necessarily be technically both at the same time, but you're using them conjunctively. So you're having the dog move from what you don't want them engaging in, quote unquote, taking it away, and providing something in its place that's appropriate, which is a positive reinforcer, again, assuming the dog finds it to be reinforcing. The choosing to heel, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's negative punishment, because you're not taking anything away from her, but you are reinforcing her choice to engage, if that makes sense. Now, if it were like she jumped up to try to get the treat out of your hand while you were healing and you pulled your hand away, that would be negative punishment in that context. The last risk con is what I saw pop up when talking to a local trainer. He says that using positive reinforcement for loose leash walking creates a yo-yo dog, but after that meeting I learned more and realized the reason he ended up with yo-yo dogs is, yes, because the timing and the placement of reinforcement. Yes, so I do use a leash pressure game, but I don't use it as the sole way to train loose leash walking. So my leash pressure game is, I'll be inside to start, and the dog will be on its leash, and I will apply just enough tension for the gear on the dog to shift, whether it's a collar or a harness, ideally a harness, just enough to shift, and then I'll call the dog's name. And what I'm doing in that context is I'm teaching the dog that the shift in harness, they should anticipate I'm going to call them, and they should return to me. And as we continue to practice, it becomes, oh, I feel tension. I'm going to create slack in the lead through repetition. And then it becomes applied to loose leash walking. But I'm also teaching loose leash walking in a context where the dog is very unlikely to pull if I'm working at the dog's individual pace. Now, accidents happen and squirrels run across the street and bunny rabbits are out there. Other dogs are barking, bouncing, all that type of stuff. But the goal is to set them up for success as much as possible. And so that's exactly right. That's why he has the accidental loop in his loose leash walking. His leash pressure was to do a pull release until the dog creates slack. Oh yes, so that's working within your negative reinforcement quadrant for sure. If the dog is the one that's actively pulling, then you may have a little bit of positive punishment in there, but primarily that's a negative reinforcement quadrant that's being worked in there. So that's not at all how I would recommend doing a leash pressure game. Oops, that's not what I wanted. I want to go back to present. Okay. So yes, accidental behavior loops. This is how I ended up having, instead of Keller standing on his pedestal to spin around it and do hind end awareness exercises, he would throw it instead. And also how I ended up with Drover do this sit and then scoot around in a circle weird thing on it. So be careful about what behaviors you're marking and reinforcing. So this is just a couple of examples of what quadrants are at play. So positive reinforcement, access to environment and exploration, play, food reward, sniffing or scent gains, replacement with an appropriate item. These are all forms of positive reinforcement. Your negative reinforcement is going to be more along the lines of like your corrective collars, so prong and e-collars. That release of the pressure or cessation of the stimulus is going to be your negative reinforcer. It's going to provide relief. Removal of physical pressure. So this kind of goes along with like choke and martingale collars. So people that teach their dogs to sit by pressing on the dog's hips. The removal of that pressure once the dog moves into the sit is a negative reinforcer. They're removing that application of pressure. And so this is how dogs, they learn to sit to avoid having their hips pushed on, basically, is a prime example of that. Choke and martingale collars are also in the negative reinforcement. Removal of a stressor or a trigger. So this would be like if you have a reactive dog and your dog is just losing its mind across the street from another dog, but that other dog doesn't move until your dog stops freaking out. That is negative reinforcement. A front clip harness or a head halter works within negative reinforcement. The dog learns to not pull to avoid being turned to the side. And you can see a lot of these are also positive punishers. So the prong and the e-collar, the application of that stimulus, and same with choke and martingale collars, the application of the stimulus in response to the undesired behavior is a positive punisher. So choke, martingale, and prong collars, this is the tightening of the collar. E-collars, this is the stim. Flooding is a positive punisher. A lot of old school, uneducated, outdated trainers preach pack walks for reactive dogs. And what this does is it puts the dogs in a position where their stress response eventually runs out. They're flooded with all of this stress to the point that they can no longer respond and their body gives up with the stress response. This is a very intense form of positive punishment. It is never recommended. Never, never, never. So if someone says, oh, I do pack walks for reactive dogs, just run away as fast as you possibly can. Because it's a bad idea. Not only that, but you run the risk of the dog becoming aggressive because they can't get away from their stressors. Yelling, hitting, any vocal or physical aggression towards the dog is a positive punisher. And then front clip harnesses and head halters, which a lot of people are surprised about. And the reason for that is because it applies an aversive stimulus. Now, the intention with these is to use negative reinforcement, but they are often two sides of the same coin because you cannot remove an aversive stimulus if one is not already present. So if you are actively using negative reinforcement, you almost always have to have a positive punisher. Negative punishment, this would be like turning around when a dog jumps, removing food reward. Body blocking is a form of negative punishment. So body blocking is where we actually stand in front of the dog to keep them from going places. What they want as reinforcement is access to the environment or an individual on the other side or an item on the other side, and we are removing that from them. Removal of access from the environment. If your dog is out there and they're, playing outside and barking at the neighbors and they're having a blast and we have them come inside, we've removed access to that reinforcer. And then front clip harness and head halters are also a negative punisher. So why are these also a negative punisher? These are a negative punisher because we are removing what the dog is seeking, assuming that the forward motion is the reinforcer for the dog. So it's not always a negative punisher, but those tools actually can work within 3 different quadrants. Questions at this point? So the removal of the stressor is it is a form of flooding, yes. And I was specifically trying to piece those out as to which quadrant those actions happen in. Now, if you're doing something like a pack walk and until the dog is removed from the quote unquote pack, the positive punisher is in place. And so what happens is with pack walks specifically, and I'm using this intentionally as an example, with pack walks, the dog is placed in an incredibly stressful setting until the stress response runs out and the undesired behavior, whether it's reactivity over excitement, whatever, has been effectively punished. And so the intentional quadrant used is positive punishment in that aspect. Once the dog is removed from the group, yes, there is negative reinforcement at play. And the reason that the dogs give up reacting is because their stress response runs out. The body can only maintain a high level of stress response for so long. It is a finite resource for them. But if you are basically if you were doing like a one-on-one reactive dog, the removal of the stressor may not occur when the dog's stress response runs out. It may occur when the dog is just not barking for a couple of seconds or kind of looks away or what have you. So to stop a dog from pulling without a head halter, this is where setting them up for success really comes into play. So I actually teach loose leash walking in the house before I ever go outside. And I do that starting without gear. And I'm just reinforcing the dog for staying within a couple of feet of me. as I walk with them and getting them into that habit. And then once we've been doing that for a couple of days, I'll add the gear. We continue practicing that. And we slowly build to being able to go outside, maybe in like the backyard or up and down the driveway. And for some dogs, it might even have to be like going in and out of the door and those sorts of things. And so you're working on it at their pace and keeping them engaged, not to the point that they're only focused on you, but to the point that they are aware of where they are in proximity to you. And so that's also where that leash pressure game that I talked about a few minutes ago kind of comes into play. So that if they get overexcited and they start to feel tension on the leash, they have already learned, oh, that means I need to come back a little bit. So we need to make sure that anytime we're working with the dog on new skills, that we're working with them at their pace and setting them up for success as much as possible, not only so that they learn the skill that we want them to, but also to make sure that we're not practicing behaviors that we don't want. And we do have some infographics about that in the infographics channel as well. So before we talk about physiological and psychological effects of punishment and reinforcement, does anybody have any other questions about the quadrants? So I make sure the leash pressure game stays positive and isn't aversive to the best of my ability. Because remember, again, the learner is who determines what's aversive and what's not. I limit it to being indoors, and I'm only putting enough pressure to shift the gear enough that the dog can feel it. There's not a lot of force applied. It's just enough so that the dog can feel their gear kind of shift a little bit, and it clues them in of like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm supposed to go back and get my treat. And yes, Kiko Pup has some really great videos on teaching leash pressure game. That's actually who I got my leash pressure game from. And I've just modified it to be a little bit toned down. And that's primarily because most of the dogs that I work with are very sensitive and have a lot of tactile sensitivities. All right, so we're going to talk about our psychological and physiological effects of punishment and reinforcement. So when we're using operant conditioning, and really just in life in general, we have some chemicals that are at play here. Primarily, these are dopamine and oxytocin, our feel-goods, and our glucocorticoids, and adrenaline, which are our feel-bad, feel-upset hormones. So dopamine and oxytocin are neurotransmitters. Dopamine is that chemical that drives the seeking system. It's the same hormone response that's actually elicited by heroin use. So they've actually found that a large spike of dopamine occurs in response to the click of a conditioned clicker. So what this tells us is that when we're utilizing our positive reinforcement quadrants and we're using something like a clicker, we're using things that the dog finds appetitive, we are exploiting that natural chemical system that makes the subject want more. And then oxytocin is also released during this. It's a chemical that aids with bonding. It's released along with dopamine during positive reinforcement training and makes it fun for them. So this is part of what enhances that bond when we're doing those things. On the flip side, we have our stress hormones, and these are the chemicals that initiate our 4Fs: flight, fight, freeze, and fidget, those stress responses. Our glucocorticoids, these are also known as steroids, and they're secreted in response to stress. They are very well documented to be elevated both acutely and chronically, so short-term and long-term, in animals that are trained with punitive or aversive methods. So dogs that are trained with prong collars, e-collars, choke chains, physical, reprimands, those sorts of things have been shown to have higher steroids in their system, both immediately after the punishment occurs and on a long-term basis. So basically, these are animals that, by comparison, are chronically stressed. And then adrenaline. So this is excreted in times of high stress, and it can cause an increased heart rate, blood pressure, and other classic signs of stress. Adrenaline and your glucocorticoids are going to be released in high quantities during flooding, for example, because it's a very high stress situation. And the really sad thing is that chronic exposure to high levels of these hormones actually deteriorates the soft tissues of the body, such as tendons and ligaments, and it can result in an increased risk of orthopedic injury. When we have pets that come in that have Cushing's syndrome, so this is hyperadrenocorticism, so their adrenal glands are producing way too much steroid, these dogs often have orthopedic problems because the steroids in their bodies are so hard on those tendons and their ligaments. And so we want to make sure that we're careful, because even if we aren't concerned about the emotional welfare, everybody wants their pets to be physically healthy. So we have to take into account the fact that these have physiological effects as well as psychological effects. And this is not even including, the potential injury that can result from having an e-collar left on at a high intensity and, burning the dog, or prong collars causing punctures, or, hitting the dog causing other injuries, those things. That's not even accounting for those parts. Now, let's talk about trainers. So trainers, we have compulsion versus balance trainers. Your compulsion trainers are going to use exclusively or primarily aversive methods to suppress the unwanted behaviors or reinforce the desired behaviors. So these are trainers that are working completely or primarily in positive punishment and negative reinforcement quadrants. These are typically people that they don't really have any education. They are often preaching way outdated theories and training methods. Unfortunately, a lot of board and trained people kind of fall within this, and a lot of the people on TV, as we've seen with like Cesar Millan, fall within this category a lot of the time. Balance trainers are going to be trainers that intentionally use all four quadrants. So many primarily use positive reinforcement and negative punishment before they resort to positive punishment and negative reinforcement. But that's not even across the board. Some balance trainers will try to use each of the four quadrants equally. Some will start with positive reinforcement and negative punishment and then use positive punishment and negative reinforcement to proof behaviors. And so it really varies. But a good chunk of these trainers do try to stay within positive reinforcement and negative punishment. Okay, I see we have a question coming up. Yeah, Cesar Millan, a lot of people think he's great, but there's a few problems with him. So for one, he's not an educated individual. All of the information that he has on canine behavior is really from the 80s, and it's very much focused on pack theory and dominance theory, which we're actually going to talk about next week. And he hasn't really made an effort to educate himself. There is, unfortunately, a video of the dog that bit the absolute crap out of his hand, Holly. You can find it on YouTube, where he is basically antagonizing her, and you can see all of the signs this dog is giving that she does not want to continue interacting with him. She's trying to de-escalate the situation, and he keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. And then she bites him, and he says, "I didn't see that coming." When anyone who knows really anything about dogs should have been able to see that coming. And he's been in court multiple times. There's just a lot of problems with the techniques that he uses, and it's only recently that I've seen any sort of real positive reinforcement from him. So I would classify him as a compulsion trainer, and a compulsion trainer is absolutely 100% someone to be avoided. I would say balance trainers are also people to be avoided if they're not willing to work in a positive reinforcement force-free manner. And we're going to clarify what that means here as well. So positive reinforcement trainers, this is actually a misnomer. So positive reinforcement trainers don't exclusively work in the positive reinforcement quadrant because that's just not possible since the learner is who dictates what is and is not reinforcing. But they do their best to stay as much in the positive reinforcement quadrant as much as they reasonably can. Many also refer to themselves as LEMA trainers due to this. So this means least intrusive, minimally aversive. Some balance trainers will refer to themselves as LEMA trainers. I personally am of the opinion that if you're a balance trainer that you're not a LEMA trainer because you're a little bit more liberal with the hierarchy of humane training, which we're going to look at here in a second. But some balance trainers will label themselves as well. This as well. So the purpose of LEMA is to be exactly what it says. Least intrusive, minimally aversive. We're trying to make training as fun as possible for the dog to help them be a happy, well-adjusted individual. The focus for positive reinforcement trainers is the prevention of practicing of unwanted behaviors and negative punishment as the consequence should those behaviors occur while reinforcing desired behaviors. So going back to our jumping example, so if the dog is greeting, we want the dog to sit, we're going to heavily reinforce the sit. If jumping still occurs, we're going to apply negative punishment and that we're going to turn around and move away from the dog. We're going to remove that attention that they're seeking. So again, negative punishment is meant as a backup for these types of trainers. Corrections are avoided, though some do use what's called no reward markers or NRMs. And what this means is it's just a signal to the dog that they were not successful. Now, no reward markers, they're really not necessary. I personally feel that it's just additional work on the part of the trainer to employ them. And if you are having to use them, then you've not adequately set the dog up for success as much as you reasonably can. And the dog doesn't really need to know what they did wrong or that they failed. They're going to know that anyways because they're not going to get their reward. But it's more important that we are focusing on reinforcing those desired behaviors. I see we have a question coming up. We have a couple. For no reward markers, is there much research on if they are effective? Could you say no when Zuko goes for my arms when playing and redirecting to a toy? Is that using an NRM? Also, do you think an NRM can be aversive? I would have to look in to see if there's much research on no reward markers. I don't think there is, but I'm not going to say for sure. Some people will use no reward markers in the context of try again. That's the most common way to use them. I would say that if you're telling Zuko no when he goes for your arms when playing, that's more of a cue for him to redirect to what you're trying to redirect him to than a no reward marker. I do think no reward markers can be aversive because if we are relying on no reward markers rather than setting dogs up for success better, then it can lead to a large amount of frustration. And I would say that that's probably not the most common thing. It seems upsetting to him and discouraging. And if it's upsetting to the dog and discouraging, I would classify it as mildly aversive. I wouldn't put it anywhere near the same category as like the use of a prong collar or anything like that. But For some dogs, it can be aversive, and it's really individual. So for, if I were to use a no reward marker for Keller, he would just offer another behavior, and eventually he would get frustrated if I was relying on that rather than relying on giving him better information. I would say using a no reward marker should be limited, and it should be limited in the context of like a single behavior that you're offering rather than or that you're seeking, rather than relied upon for the dog to make the correct decision, if that makes sense. I still slip sometimes, and I'll tell Keller no, and then I'll say, I didn't do that right, and just remind myself that if I'm having to give that no reward marker to quote unquote correct the dog, I haven't really adequately done my job, whether it's adequate reinforcement of the behavior that I want, whether it's the environmental setup. So if I'm having to give, if I feel that slip more than once, that's a clue to me that I need to look around and see what I need to change for the session, if that makes sense. Yeah, oh, Luna. Yeah, some dogs do. They do get upset if you tell them no, because it's not really giving them any information as to what you want them to do. You're just telling them what you didn't want. So it's not as good a communication. And at the end of it, it's just not as good a communication. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit more about Lima and the humane hierarchy of dog training, and really this is the same for any animal because learning is universal. So this is basically a guide of how to ethically and appropriate escalate your training methods. So our first exit on this road is ensuring that the animal is well. Okay? So we want to make sure that all of their needs have been met. If we're not meeting all of their needs, we need to stop here and make sure all of those are met. The next exit is antecedent arrangements. And what that means is basically setting the dog up for success in the environment. We want to make sure that we're not setting them up for failure by accident. And we're going to talk about antecedents here in another lecture that's called the ABCs of dog training: antecedents, behavior, consequences. So we'll go more into that. But the antecedent is basically what happens before the behavior occurs. So we want to make sure that we arrange those as best as possible to set the dog up for success. Going back to loose leash walking, this is why I'm starting inside. I'm in an environment that is conducive to the dog being able to perform how I want them to in order to reinforce the desired behavior. If I were to try starting loose leash walking outside, I'm not going to have as good environmental control. The events that happen before the behavior occurs are not going to be in my favor. So this is part of us being responsible dog trainers. Our next exit is positive reinforcement. So we've met the dog's needs. We're in an appropriate environment with an appropriate setup for the dog to be successful. Now we want to reinforce those desired behaviors. Now, if we're struggling there, if we're not able to get the behaviors still, our methods aren't working for this dog, we need to go to the next exit: differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So this would be like if you have a reactive dog and you teach them to do things like look at you once the trigger is presented, or turn around and sit, or something that's other than the unwanted behavior. Okay, so we're giving them alternatives, we're giving them choices that they can make that are going to be more worth their time and energy than engaging in what we don't want them to be doing. Now, you'll notice that the next exit has a yield sign. And this is where we start getting into extinction, negative reinforcement, and intentional negative punishments. Remember, negative punishment is really intended to be a backup to positive reinforcement as much as we reasonably can have it be. if we're intentionally applying negative punishment, that's getting into not very fair to the dog. So we want to make sure we've hit all of these other exits before then. However, if you're getting to the point that you are considering extinction, negative reinforcement, or negative punishment, and extinction is where we're just keeping behaviors from occurring, so they basically just go away, which often includes a lot of frustration. Before you get to that exit, you need to be consulting with another professional. So if you haven't already consulted with a professional and you're a pet owner, you need to consult with a professional, a qualified behavior professional. If you are a professional and you've reached this point, you need to consult with your colleagues, someone who's more experienced than you, someone who has had more practice, someone maybe who uses different methods that still fall within these bottom 4 exits. You need to be reaching out and asking for assistance because we want to try to avoid going to this exit as much as we can. Because the last exit is positive punishment. Positive punishment is a last resort. And by last resort, I mean this should only be used when advised by a qualified behavioral expert. I'm talking board certified veterinary behaviorist, clinical applied animal behaviorist, those individuals. Because there's really no reason we should ever need to apply positive punishment. Oh, yes. Question from earlier. Do kitties' brains also release dopamine and oxytocin from positive reinforcement training? Yes, they do. Yes. So this says dog training, but all of the things in this slideshow are applicable across species. It is in the context of dog training because most of the animals that we're working with in this server are dogs, but it is applicable across species. So if you are working with a professional and you're looking at this chart and you feel that they have escalated their training methods too far too fast, that's a big red flag. You can find this chart on Google. It's part of the International Association of Animal Behavior Consultants information, as well as Certification Council of Professional Dog Trainers. Would any of those professionals advise that over BE? What is BE? I'm not understanding the context of that. Oh, behavioral euthanasia. So yes, I would say that if you're considering having to go to positive punishment, behavioral euthanasia has probably already been discussed. I personally can't think of any situations that would call for the intentional use of positive punishment. And that's including dogs that have, bite histories, dogs that have just been in chronic shutdown. It's not something that I can fathom that there is a real use of because, again, it goes into suppressing the behavior. So all of these exits before positive punishment are behavior modification. And positive punishment would really only be if behavioral euthanasia was declined by the client, they were insistent on keeping the animal, but these other methods did not work. And this is also, assuming that they either have tried or have declined behavioral medication. So I would agree that if your pet is at the point that you are considering positive punishment, or your behaviorist has recommended positive punishment, behavioral euthanasia has already been in the discussion. It's already been on the table. And it would be more humane because a life of behavioral suppression is an unfair life. Now, this is the intentional application of positive punishment. This is not including accidental positive punishers. Those do happen sometimes. These are all intentional methods that are being applied on purpose. Okay, so we're going to talk about force-free trainers. So force-free trainers are a subsect of positive reinforcement LEMA trainers. These are trainers that they prefer what's called errorless learning contingencies. So going back to our antecedent arrangements here, this is where errorless learning contingencies are applied. And what that means is the environment and the entire setup for training for this animal is built on making it so that they can really only succeed. Their risk of failure is as minimized as possible. And what happens is we're preventing the practicing of unwanted behaviors. We are able to heavily reinforce desired behaviors. And we are able to gradually integrate things into the environment and the learning setup to prepare the dog for being out in the real world. So these trainers don't rely on gear that other positive reinforcement or LEMA trainers may deem appropriate, such as head halters or no-pull harnesses, but they might use them as safety nets for certain cases. So for example, I am a force-free trainer. My preference is to have a back clip harness, so it's a harness that attaches to the leash behind the shoulders. I do not like front clip harnesses. I do not like head halters, but if I have a client who maybe has a big, strong dog and they're very frail, we may consider using that as a safety net in case, oh gosh, the dog takes off unexpectedly. It's much less likely for this person to be dragged down the street. But we're going to do everything in our power to make sure that we don't need to employ that gear. We also avoid coercion that can occur sometimes during positive reinforcement training techniques. And coercion occurs when the reinforcing is so tempting that the learner cannot help but acquire it despite intense fear, anxiety, or stress. So if, let's say, you have a dog that is nervous of new people, and you have a new person hold out a treat for this dog, and this dog is leaning in, not coming up to the person with loose, relaxed body language, but like leaning in, trying to keep their feet planted, but trying to also get the treat. That is coercion. That is the use of something that the animal cannot help but try to get in a situation that they are very uncomfortable in. So this is not to say that positive reinforcement or LEMA trainers do this on purpose, but I would say that force-free trainers are better about avoiding this even by accident. And because, again, they're setting up those errorless learning contingencies, so they're not going to have the dog greet 100 people a week to get over their fear. They're going to have the dog learn to be more comfortable in the presence of people they don't know way before they worry about having the dog accept treats from strangers. Does that all make sense? Okay. So that's really what we have for today. Does anybody have any questions before I let you all go? And Moss, I actually am going to be heading back out for the day, but I will happily talk with you another time if you would like. Okay. So, last chance for questions. If you have any, go ahead and ask them. I didn't have an assistant today, so I forgot to modify this slide. But notes will be posted for this in the voice chat notes channel, so you guys are welcome to check them out there. It's going to be a couple of days before I get the presentation video up for you guys to review, but it will be on the Creature Teachers YouTube channel for people to view at another time. This is a subject that we will occasionally revisit as well. especially because we do have lots of people that come in and out of the server, so I want to make sure that we're providing that education as much as possible. Next week, we're going to be talking about dominance theory in dogs. And after that, we're going to be doing a couple of feline behavior lectures as well. So I'll keep posting updates of the schedule for you guys. Yes, you are welcome to share the video. That is totally fine. And if you have any questions, certainly feel free to ask them. Free Training Advice Channel is an absolutely appropriate channel to be asking questions about the quadrants of operant conditioning. And we're going to be doing some really cool lectures coming up. For those of you who have a training role that are listening in, please make sure that you are signing up for any voice chats that you would like to do. Even if you don't have a date that you want to do them, you can put your name in them on the spreadsheet. Whether you want to assist or what have you, totally fine. We have about 50 subjects that we have had people ask for us to present. So please make sure that you're signing up, and so we can get those done. And that's not including subjects that the trainers themselves want to present. I have a lot of stuff that I want to present, but I also want to make sure that we're talking about stuff that you guys have asked for. So if you have subjects that you would like covered for voice chats, please put them in the suggestion box channel. We always are taking suggestions for that. Really helps us to know what you guys want to learn so we can prepare those things. Again, next week is dominance theory in dogs. The week after is going to be normal feline behaviors. And after that will be the feline enrichment presentation as well. I will go ahead and link the spreadsheet so that you guys can look at it, but only the trainers will have access to modify it. Okay. Does anybody have any further questions? Oh, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I always have fun making these presentations for you guys. I know that we have some about reptiles and stuff that may be repeated as well, because I know Gina and Tony really like the reptiles. So, yeah, just stay tuned. We're going to... I don't have a specific schedule as to when all of these are going to be. We're going to try to get them on a regular basis for you guys. I just happened this month to have 4 Sundays in a row free to do it. So for this month, we'll have them weekly moving forward. I'm not sure what the schedule will be. Subthreshold training is not on the list. I will add it to the list for you. Thanks so much. That is a fantastic topic. So we will make sure that we are getting that in there. We have some other stuff about like fear-free cooperative care and that sort of stuff that we did last year. So the next few coming up are going to be representations of things we've already done. But we have a lot more people in the server now, so I wanted to relaunch those and get these going again. Thanks so much, guys, for tuning in. Here is our list of resources that were used for this presentation. And again, if you guys have any questions or concerns, please let us know.